currency over a large number of countries. You had taken away two of the most important adjustment mechanisms responding to a shock. That is to say, the interest rate, you lower interest rates and that stimulates the economy. Exchange rate, you lower your exchange rate and that stimulates demand for your exports. They'd taken away those two instruments and they hadn't put anything in its place. And so economists said, the test of the euro is not whether it does well in 2003, 4, and 5, it's what happens when there's a shock. And 2008 really proved their worries were serious. The euro has done, the eurozone has done abysmally. It was, as I say, founded on the best of ideals. It wanted to bring the countries of Europe together. It was a political project with the idea that, it wasn't economists that were behind it. It was a political project, that the idea that the euro would bring a lot of prosperity, that prosperity would enhance the degree of solidarity among European citizens. Sharing a single currency would give them a sense of identity, and that would then further the European project, the project of European integration. Unfortunately, at that moment in 1992, the sense of European identity, solidarity, was not strong enough to do what was required to make a single currency work, given the diversity of countries within the euro. And they knew that. But the hope was that in the ensuing years, the success of the euro, the prosperity that it would bring, there was a theory of political reform that would in turn lead to greater willingness to, you might say, finish the project, to do the other things that were necessary, and that would, a virtuous circle that would then enhance greater European integration. What's happened, of course, is being just the opposite. Because the institutions that would make a single currency work weren't put in place, the Eurozone, when it was afflicted by this crisis, by this disturbance coming from across the waters, it would have happened anyway, but the precipitating event was the 2008 American crisis. It led to recessions, depressions, and rather than economic prosperity, it's been just the opposite. And rather than solidarity, it's actually led to more political divisiveness than I've ever seen in a half a century. So let me just describe in a few minutes what's happened to their economy. The crisis began in the United States. We have a recovery, a weak recovery, but still a recovery. They're really still in stagnation. Many of the countries, the crisis countries, are in depression. And when I say depression, I use that word advisedly. The economic downturns in Spain and Greece and Portugal and Ireland were greater than the Great Depression. The Greek downturn was more than 25%. The unemployment rate in these countries, in Spain, they celebrate in Spain, Europe is celebrating, they say things are really on the mend. Unemployment is only 20%. And youth unemployment is only 50%. And it's, of course, been that way for a long time. Of course, 20% is better than 25%. But at this pace, they'll be back to normal sometime in the middle of the next decade. Young people who've been out of a job for a very long time, really eroding the basis of their society. So, I could go through the statistics, but I think that the point should be clear that, that this has been a terrible, hard to describe how bad economic episode. The question is why, and to me, the single explanation is the euro. Now, there's a debate about what aspect of the euro. And there are some people, including one of the writers from the Financial Times, who argue there was nothing wrong with the euro, it was only the policymakers. They had the wrong policies. And let me say, he's right. The policymakers were terrible. They couldn't have done worse. Well, yes, they could have. But they did a really, really bad job. But the point of my book is to argue that even if you had the most brilliant policymakers, given the structure, the rules that they had set up in 1992, it could not have worked. And, you know, it could not have worked without their changing those rules. One of the problems is not only didn't they have enough economic similarity of the countries to share this common currency, they didn't have enough political congruence, political, not only solidarity, but perspective on what makes for a good economy. You can't write down everything ahead of time. You have to have, you do need policymakers to make a decision. But if the policymakers have very different views of what makes for good economics, then you're going to have divisiveness. And it's going to be hard to have consistency, and it's going to be, you know, things won't work. One side is going to be imposing policies on the other side, and there's going to be a lot of unhappiness. Now, the particular example I've already mentioned, they had the view that all you needed to make the economies function well is to keep deficits low. That theory, most economists didn't think was right in the beginning. But then, looked at the crisis, it became clear that that theory was wrong. Ireland and Spain, two of the countries that had crises, let me step back. You know, Greece did have a problem with fiscal profligacy. So you can have a problem with fiscal profligacy. I mean, that's right. And Greece is what everybody talks about. One has to remember that the United States was complicitous, or American firms were complicitous in Greece's problem, because Goldman Sachs derivatives were designed to hide what was going on inside Greece. So we helped the Greek government hide their deficits. So, so Greece is the story of profligacy. But Ireland and Spain actually had a surplus before the crisis. So you can't blame deficits, you can't blame profligacy as the source of that crisis. If Greece was the only country that had a problem, there wouldn't be a euro crisis. Greece is a small country, 10 million people. We would say the Greek crisis. We wouldn't say the euro crisis. But the fact is, it is many, many countries around Europe. And even the countries that are not really in crisis, Italy and France, are near crisis. I won't say how near, because I don't want to call it a panic, but things are not going well, and they know that, and everybody knows that, and there are, you know, potentially real problems, particularly right now in Italy. So when you have so many countries having difficulties, countries that before 2008 were growing strongly, countries that before the euro were doing well, their standard of living was low because some of these countries didn't have the human capital, didn't have structural problems, but they were still growing and they were catching up. But the euro has meant that, as I say, large numbers are not doing well. So if you have so many countries that are having difficulty, you have to conclude it's a systemic problem. And that leads to a need for a systemic analysis. What is the source of the problem? So much of my book is trying to explain why it's not just the policies, it's the structure. Unfortunately, when Germany looked at the facts, you know, of the crisis, and they've become the dominant power in what is going on in dictating the terms of what the countries are in crisis are doing, and even more broadly in the Eurozone. Their interpretation is to double down on a failed experiment. In other words, they say, rather than saying what I just said, well, you know, deficits are a problem, but there's something else going on. They've ignored Ireland, Spain, Portugal, all these other examples, and keep focusing on Greece. And they said, what we have to do is more austerity, more budget cutting, make sure the countries don't violate the deficits. But the deficits weren't the problem. The downturn caused the deficits and the debt, not the other way around. So it reminds me a little bit of medieval bloodletters. When medieval bloodletting, remember the theory was that when you were sick, it was because you had bad humors in your blood, and the only way to get rid of the bad humors was to get rid of the blood. And they would have leeches, a big market for leeches. Then they would leach out the blood. And typically, as one could imagine, when you did that, the patient didn't thrive. And when they started getting sicker and sicker, the medieval doctor said, oh, obviously the answer is we haven't let enough blood out. And most of the patients died, but one of the wonders of the mind is a few patients survived by a miracle. And those were the ones that they would talk about. And they would say, see, it works. But of course, 99% of the time it didn't. Well, Germany's attitude was a little bit the same. Austerity has essentially never worked. But they still believe it works. They've doubled down on that recipe, and the bloodletting patients are getting sicker and sicker. So, yeah. Oh. Okay. Oh. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. Okay, start all over again. Okay. So let me very briefly describe some of the structural problems that I think of as inherent in the structure of the Eurozone. The first I've already talked about, this restriction. Two of them I've already talked about. The single-minded focus on inflation in the European Central Bank, that was part of the structure. The second one is the single-minded focus on the deficit. They had taken away, as I said, the two of the adjustment mechanisms, the exchange rate and the interest rate, hadn't put anything in its place, but instead actually tied the hands by saying you can't use fiscal policy and you can't use monetary policy to stimulate the economy. They understood that they wanted to have the countries converge, get more similar, but they put in place rules that actually led to the countries getting further and further apart.